Death is supposed to be the end, a final silence that settles over the departed. But sometimes, the dead aren't done speaking. Sometimes, their voices linger, echoing through the places they once knew. This is the story of how I came to hear the voices from the grave. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone else, and secrets are hard to keep. I was just passing through, a traveler with no particular destination, when my car broke down on the outskirts. The nearest mechanic was miles away, and I had no choice but to stay the night. That's how I found myself at the only inn in town, a place that had seen better days but still had a roof and a bed. The innkeeper was an elderly woman, her face lined with age and something else, a sadness, perhaps, or a secret too heavy to carry. She handed me a key without much conversation, just a warning, stay inside after dark. The town's quiet, but it's best not to wander. Her words lingered in my mind as I climbed the stairs to my room. My room was small, just a bed, a chair, and a window that overlooked the cemetery next door. It was an old graveyard, with crumbling headstones and crooked crosses, a place forgotten by time. As I looked out at the rows of graves, a chill ran down my spine. Something about that place felt off. But I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the weariness of travel. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the first whisper. At first, it was so faint I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was something else. A voice, soft and distant, like someone speaking from far away. I sat up, straining to hear, but the voice faded into the night. The next night, the whisper returned, stronger this time. I could make out words now, but they were jumbled, disjointed, like a broken radio signal. I got out of bed and moved to the window, looking out at the cemetery. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the graves. And that's when I saw it, movement among the tombstones. At first, I thought it was an animal, or maybe just my imagination. But then I saw it again, a figure, small and hunched, moving slowly between the graves. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person. I watched, frozen, as the figure stopped in front of a grave, standing there for what felt like an eternity. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the cemetery. The figure suddenly turned, as if sensing my gaze, and I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep after that. The voice in the cemetery, the figure in the night, it all swirled in my mind, keeping me awake. I needed to know what was happening, to understand what I had seen and heard. The next morning, I questioned the innkeeper about the cemetery, but she just shook her head, her eyes avoiding mine. The past should stay buried, was all she said. But I couldn't let it go. I spent the day exploring the town, asking questions, piecing together the history of the place. What I learned was disturbing. The cemetery had a dark past, unmarked graves, bodies buried without proper rites, and a local legend about a grave that was never supposed to be opened. That night, I returned to the cemetery, determined to find answers. The air was thick with fog, and the moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the place in an eerie darkness. I made my way to the grave I had seen the figure standing by. The headstone was old, the name weathered and nearly illegible, but the date was clear, over a century ago. I knelt beside the grave, brushing away the dirt and leaves. As I did, the whispering began again, louder now, coming from directly beneath me. My heart pounded as I realized what I was hearing. It wasn't just a voice. It was the voice of someone buried alive. I scrambled back, horrified, but I couldn't leave. I had to know. I grabbed a nearby stone and began digging, pulling away the earth with my bare hands. The voice grew louder, more desperate, until finally, I uncovered the lid of an old wooden coffin. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside the coffin was nothing but bones and a tattered piece of cloth. But the voice was still there, echoing in my mind, filling the night with its mournful cries. I realized then that it wasn't just the person in the grave who had been trapped, it was their soul, their spirit, unable to move on, forever bound to the place of their death. I buried the bones again, carefully, respectfully, and said a prayer over the grave. The voice faded, but the weight of what I had uncovered remained. I left the town the next morning, my car miraculously repaired, but I knew I would never truly leave that place behind. The voices of the dead are not meant for the living. They speak of things we cannot understand, of pain and suffering beyond our comprehension. But sometimes, they find a way to reach out, to be heard, to remind us that the past is never really gone. It lingers, just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispering returned. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a random noise, it was a voice, speaking words I couldn't understand, but with a tone that chilled me to the bone. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me, trying to make me listen. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the voice wouldn't stop. It followed me wherever I went, at work, at home, even in my dreams. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the voice still echoing in my mind. And then, one night, the voice became clear. It spoke my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was coming from outside, from the cemetery. It was calling me, beckoning me to come closer, to listen. I tried to resist, but some unseen force, compelled me to rise from my bed and walk out into the night. The cemetery was shrouded in darkness, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I made my way to the old grave where I had found the box, the voice growing louder with each step. And then, as I reached the grave, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. I watched in horror as the earth began to shift, as the grave itself seemed to come alive. And then, the ground split open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From within that hole came the voice, no longer a whisper, but a scream of pure, unrelenting terror. I tried to run, to flee from whatever nightmare I had unleashed, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, forced to listen as the voice told its story, a story of betrayal, of murder, of a soul trapped in eternal torment, crying out for justice. The voice belonged to a woman who had been buried alive, centuries ago, in that very spot. She had been wronged, accused of witchcraft, and sealed away in a coffin, left to die in the cold, dark earth. But her spirit never left, her soul trapped in the confines of her grave, bound by the curse that had condemned her. And now, she wanted revenge. She wanted someone to hear her story, to feel her pain, to suffer as she had suffered. And I was the one who would set her free. I knew I had to do something, anything, to put her spirit to rest. I returned to the cemetery the next day, determined to find a way to end the curse. I searched the archives, spoke to the oldest villagers, trying to piece together the story, to find a way to silence the voice. But the more I learned, the more I realized how deep the curse ran, how powerful it was. The villagers had known all along. That's why they stayed away, why they never disturbed the graves. They knew the voice was real, that it was more than just a story. And they knew that once it was awakened, it could never be silenced. In the end, there was only one way to end it. I had to return the box to the grave, to seal it away, just as it had been before. I gathered what little courage I had left and made my way back to the cemetery, the bell clutched tightly in my hand. As the last bit of earth covered the box, the voice fell silent. The ground stopped trembling, the air grew still, and for the first time in weeks, there was peace. I stood there, staring at the grave, knowing that I had done what needed to be done, but feeling no sense of victory, only a deep, aching sorrow. I left the village the next morning, packing my things in silence and avoiding the eyes of those who had warned me. As I drove away, the dense fog clinging to the winding mountain roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered behind. Something unfinished, something unresolved. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. But the memory of that voice, of the cold, dark grave, refused to fade. I tried to put it behind me, to move on, but the dreams wouldn't stop. Every night, I would hear her whispering, calling to me, just as she had before. It wasn't long before I started to hear it during the day too, in the rustling of leaves, in the whisper of the wind, in the dead of night when the world was silent and still. I knew then that burying the box, sealing the grave, hadn't been enough. I had only silenced the voice temporarily, and now it was growing stronger. The curse wasn't broken, it had only shifted, passed on from the grave to me. There was no escaping it, no way to undo what had been done. I had unleashed something far beyond my understanding, and now it was part of me. The voice wasn't just in the grave anymore, it was in my mind, in my very soul. I've come to accept it now, the voice that whispers to me day and night. I've stopped trying to fight it, stopped trying to silence it. Because deep down, I know it's too late for that. The voice is no longer trapped in the grave, it's trapped in me. And one day, when my time comes, it will pass to someone else. The voice from the grave will find a new host, a new mind to haunt. Because some curses are eternal. And so, the voice lives on, waiting, watching, for the next one to listen. This ending ties the story together with a chilling revelation, leaving the audience with a lingering sense of dread and inevitability. The cyclical nature of the curse hints at the horror continuing beyond the story, creating an unsettling conclusion that stays with the listener.